"You're late again." Elise Blake's words were controlled, but his tone held a mix of concern, frustration, and a hint of doubt. Without looking up as she entered, he focused on the cold coffee in his hand. The clock on the wall chimed 10. Elise paused briefly, her keys slipping from her fingers and landing with a faint jingle on the granite countertop. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's been hectic, Blake," she said too evenly, slipping off her heels, the usual rhythm of her steps replaced by an uncertain silence. Blake's gaze drifted to her bag, its strap fraying from wear, a minor detail, but one that caught his attention now. She tossed it onto the sofa with a bit too much force, as if discarding a heavy load. He nodded slowly, carefully placing his coffee cup down. "Big client deal," he echoed, his tone balanced between doubt and acceptance. "Yeah, a big deal," she replied quickly, hurriedly taking off her jacket. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons as though betraying her unease. "Just a few more late nights, and it'll be wrapped up." The silence between them grew, tense like a frayed rope ready to snap. Blake could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and a distant dog barking in the neighbor's yard. Elise moved toward the hallway, eager to escape, but he stopped her with a pointed question, posed casually. "Which client?" "Which client?" She halted, turning slightly but avoiding his eyes. "You don't know them," she answered too quickly, forcing a laugh that rang hollow through the room. "Just boring financial stuff, you wouldn't be interested." Blake nodded again, slowly. "Right, boring." Without another word, Elise turned and walked toward the bathroom, closing the door with a soft click, soon followed by the sound of running water. Blake let out a long, heavy breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He rose, his legs stiff, and went to the window, looking out over their quiet suburban street bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. The scene looked ordinary, but to him, everything felt off. His movements were almost automatic as he tidied the living room, folding the blanket, straightening the magazines, lining up the remotes. These little rituals used to make the house feel like home now. Each felt empty. Walking over to Elise's bag, he felt a tightness in his chest. He reached out to open it, but withdrew his hand just as quickly, shame twisting in his stomach. "This is crazy," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'm being paranoid." Or was he? The late nights, the vague excuses, the distance between them, it felt like a wall growing thicker with every passing day. He wanted to believe he was overthinking, wanted to trust her, to be wrong. Turning back to the bathroom door, he could imagine her standing under the hot water, washing away the day or whatever she wanted to forget. He clenched his jaw, he needed clarity. The next morning their routine resumed with almost painful normalcy. Blake made coffee, filling the kitchen with the familiar scent. Elise entered wearing a blue blouse he'd always admired, and kissed him on the cheek as if nothing had changed. "Morning," she greeted, reaching for a mug. "Morning," he replied, watching her carefully as she poured her coffee, her movements smooth but her face unreadable. "Do you have meetings today?" he asked, stirring sugar into his cup, keeping his tone casual. "A few," she replied, taking a sip and glancing at the clock. "I'll need to leave early." Another late night, he forced himself to sound merely curious. She paused with her mug halfway to her lips. "Probably. You know how it is." "Yeah," he murmured, setting his spoon down. "I know." She glanced at him, something flickering across her face, annoyance, fear, regret, he couldn't tell. Finishing her coffee quickly, she left with a hasty goodbye, her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. Blake sat at the table, staring at the spot where she'd been. The doubt gnawed at him. Was he reading too much into everything, or was this the reality of betrayal? By the third night, Blake couldn't take it anymore. When Elise came in at 10:30, he was waiting, seated in an armchair, shadows stretching long across the room. She froze upon seeing him, surprise flashing across her face before she masked it with indifference. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning casualness. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, watching her intently. She shifted under his gaze. "I'm going to bed." She turned to leave, but he stood abruptly. "Elise," wait, the desperation in his voice surprised him. She stopped, one hand gripping the railing. "What is it, Blake?" she asked, weariness or something else in her tone. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping toward her. "You're always tired, you're hardly ever here. I just want to know if there's something you're not telling me." Her eyes flashed and he saw something there: anger, defensiveness, maybe even panic. "You're imagining things. Work is stressful, that's all." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice raw. "Please." She glared at him, her jaw set. "I'm done talking about this." Without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. Blake didn't follow. He sank back down into the chair, the heavy silence pressing on him. Something had broken, and he wasn't sure it could ever be mended. That night, Blake barely slept, tossing and turning, haunted by fragments of conversations, fleeting glances, and half-truths. By dawn, he had made up his mind he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, Blake sat at the kitchen table, the early light casting a cold glow across the room. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. He drummed his fingers on the table, lost in thought. Alan, the private investigator, was discreet, dependable, and known for his blunt honesty, just what Blake needed and feared. "I can start immediately," Mr. Reeves, Alan had said when they first met. He was a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense attitude, dressed plainly to blend in. "You'll have answers soon." Blake nodded, unable to find words, and handed over the initial payment, feeling both a sense of dread and grim relief. Someone else would dig up the truth he couldn't bear to face alone. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Every night, Elise returned later and later, wearing that same unsettling smile. The tension between them grew, casting a shadow over what had once been a warm, bright home. She moved around him cautiously, as if fearful of what might come out if she got too close. Their conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges, and any semblance of intimacy had turned into empty gestures. Blake felt like a ghost in his own marriage, each day waiting for a call that might unravel everything. That call came early on a Tuesday morning. Blake had just finished buttoning his shirt when his phone buzzed, displaying Alan's name. His heart sank as he hesitated, then picked up, forcing himself to keep steady. "Mr. Reeves, you might want to sit down." Alan's voice was low but steady. Blake's throat tightened as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Just tell me." There was a pause, then. "It's as you feared. Your wife is having an affair." The word struck him like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he leaned against the counter. Who, he managed to whisper. "A businessman named Richard. Does that name sound familiar?" The air seemed to leave Blake's lungs. Richard, the self-assured executive Elise had met at a networking event 6 months ago. Blake recalled how she'd mentioned him, dismissing his concerns as paranoia. Now anger and hurt rose in him. "Tell me everything." Alan's voice remained calm as he shared the details: meetings at upscale hotels, extended dinners, secret weekend getaways. He mentioned photos and videos, each word sending chills down Blake's spine. Blake closed his eyes. The thought of seeing Elise with another man was unbearable, yet he needed the truth. Send it. That night, Blake sat alone in the darkened living room, his laptop glowing faintly. He opened the folder Alan had sent, each file like a knife to the heart photos of Elise and Richard, hands entwined, faces alight with shared laughter, videos of private moments in hotel lobbies, intimate dinners, and embraces that left no doubt. He couldn't breathe. Slamming the laptop shut, rage boiled in his chest. How could she do this? Every memory they'd shared felt like a cruel lie. He wanted to confront her, to shout, to demand answers. But he also wanted to hide, to pretend this wasn't real. Instead, Blake drove aimlessly, his mind racing, finally stopping at a park they used to visit. The air was crisp, and the night was still. Happy memories surfaced now, tainted, and he sat on a bench, feeling the weight of betrayal press down on him. The woman he loved, the life they'd built, lay shattered. His phone buzzed. It was Alan again. "Mr. Reeves, are you all right?" Blake didn't answer immediately, swallowing hard before replying in a hollow voice, "Thank you, Alan. You did your job." "If there's anything else you need," Alan began, but Blake ended the call. There was nothing else, just pain, betrayal, and the bitter realization that nothing would be the same. Blake sat in the dim living room, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the door. The sun had long since set, leaving only the faint glow of a single lamp. The folder of damning evidence lay on the coffee table, a grim display of Elise's lies and betrayals. His pulse pounded in his chest, a relentless beat of anger and heartbreak. The sound of a car door closing pulled him from his thoughts. He watched through the window as she approached, carrying the same casual demeanor she'd had each night since the affair began. The sight only deepened the ache within him. The door creaked open, and Elise stepped inside. Her smile faded when she saw him waiting. "You're still up?" she asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice as she set down her purse, avoiding his gaze. Blake rose slowly from the couch. "We need to talk." Elise froze, her eyes darting to the folder. She forced a laugh. "What's this about?" "You're scaring me." Blake picked up the folder, his grip tightening before he let it drop onto the coffee table, photos spilling out images of her with Richard in embraces that shattered whatever was left of his trust. "What's this?" she asked, voice trembling as she stared at the evidence. "You tell me." Blake's voice was icy, each word a blade. He watched her face pale, her hands shaking as she reached for the photos. "Blake, I can explain," she said, her voice cracking, tears welling in her eyes. Blake laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Explain." He stepped closer, eyes blazing with hurt. "You've been sneaking around with him while I—" His voice broke, his breath hitching as he turned away, unable to look at her. "I don't even want to hear it." Elise's knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Blake, it was a mistake. I love you. I was confused. It didn't mean anything." She reached out, but he recoiled, as if her touch would burn him. "Didn't mean anything." His voice rose, raw with pain. "Every lie you told, every night you came home late, every time you looked me in the eye and acted like nothing was wrong, that was all meaningless." She nodded desperately, tears flowing faster. "Yes, it was a terrible mistake. I was lost, but I love you, Blake. I always have." She crawled closer, her face etched with desperation. "We can fix this. We can go back." Blake shook his head, his hands trembling. "Back to what?" He gestured to the scattered photos. "This? There is no going back, Elise." She sobbed, her body shaking. "Please, I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just don't leave me." She reached out again, but he moved away. He turned, his heart pounding, every memory of their life together, every laugh, every quiet moment, every plan for the future now felt tarnished. Walking to the counter, he picked up a manila envelope, refusing to look at her as he placed it on the coffee table. "Those are divorce papers. Sign them." Her eyes widened, the gravity of his words sinking in. "No, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," Blake replied, his tone final. He turned to leave, needing distance from the woman he no longer knew, but her next words stopped him cold. "Do you really think your little salary compares?" Her tone was sharp, filled with venom. She stood, wiping away her tears with sudden fierceness. "My rich father will ruin you. He'll make sure you lose everything. You'll regret this, you pathetic fool. You'll regret leaving me." He paused, disbelief and anger flickering in his eyes. "Are you threatening me now?" "It's not a threat, Blake. It's a promise." Her face hardened, the vulnerability replaced with a cold, unforgiving mask. "You think you can just walk away and take half?" "My father will destroy you in court. You'll be nothing." Blake stared at her, the woman he'd once vowed to cherish, now standing before him like a stranger, someone prepared to ruin him rather than face her own actions. Taking a steadying breath, he tried to calm the storm inside. "You're really that far gone, aren't you?" "I'm fighting for what's mine," she shot back, folding her arms. "You want to end this? Fine, but don't think I'll make it easy." Blake's eyes hardened. "You ended this, Elise. You did this." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy but determined. "Where are you going?" she called out, a note of desperation creeping back into her voice. He stopped, hand on the doorknob. To get out of this nightmare. Without another word, he walked out, leaving her alone in the ruins of what they'd built together. Blake drove through the night, the city lights blurring past. He ended up at the beach, waves crashing against the shore. Stepping out, the cold air stung his skin, but he let it clear his head. The rage and hurt roared within, but as he stared out at the horizon, He made himself a promise he wouldn't let Elise or her father ruin him. This fight was far from over, and Blake was prepared. The morning light barely filtered through the blinds in Blake's small, sparsely furnished apartment. He hadn't slept. The events of his confrontation with Elise replayed over and over, a relentless loop of betrayal and harsh words. His coffee sat cold on the kitchen counter, untouched, while the silence around him felt oppressive. But his thoughts were louder than any noise. The sudden buzz of his phone on the table made him jump. Half expecting another desperate message from Elise, he answered without checking the caller ID. "Hello." Reeves came the deep, gravelly voice. Blake's breath caught. He knew that voice too well. Arthur Langford, Elise's father, who had never hidden his disdain for Blake. Blake straightened, every muscle tense. "Arthur." A pause, then a low chuckle. "What's this nonsense I hear about a divorce?" Arthur's tone was icy, laced with scorn. "I warned you, boy. I told you you'd never be good enough for her." Blake gritted his teeth, hating the way Arthur always spoke down to him, as if he were nothing. "Stay out of this," he replied, his tone controlled but edged with steel. "This is between me and Elise." Arthur's laugh was cold and cruel. "Is it? You think you can just leave my daughter, walk away from this family? Let me be clear, you'll sign whatever papers Elise puts in front of you and disappear quietly. Otherwise." Blake's grip on the phone tightened. "Otherwise what?" "Otherwise," Arthur's voice grew darker, "you'll never work in this city again. I have friends everywhere. One call, and you'll be done. No job, no future. You'll be lucky to scrape by." Blake felt a wave of fury surge through him. He had built his career from the ground up, worked hard to become more than just the man Arthur looked down on. He clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his composure. "All you have are threats." "It's not a threat," Arthur replied smoothly. "It's a promise. Walk away. Let Elise be with someone who can actually give her what she deserves." Blake's blood boiled. "You mean Richard, right? The man she's been seeing behind my back. That's who you want for your daughter?" A pause, a brief crack in Arthur's smug demeanor. Then, with disdain, Arthur replied, "Richard is a man of means. He can give her what you never could: status, wealth, influence." Blake closed his eyes, trying to shut out Arthur's words. "This isn't about money. This is about betrayal." Arthur's tone grew colder. "This is your last warning, Reeves. If you don't back down, I will destroy you." The line went dead before Blake could respond. He lowered the phone, his heart pounding. The threat echoed in his mind as he paced his apartment. He had known that divorcing Elise would be tough, but he hadn't anticipated an all-out war. Grabbing his keys, he left, hoping some fresh air would clear his head. He wandered the busy streets, life bustling around him even as his own seemed to crumble. Stopping at a small coffee shop he used to frequent with Elise, the memory stung, but he forced himself to stay. He ordered a coffee and watched people pass by, his mind churning. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from his lawyer. Clara need to discuss strategy. Urgent. Blake's mind raced as he stared at the message. Arthur wasn't bluffing. The man would pull every string to ruin him. But Blake wasn't about to surrender. He called Clara back. Clara's voice was brisk but sympathetic. "I've heard rumblings. Arthur Langford is already making moves." "Of course he is," Blake muttered, rubbing his forehead. "What are we up against?" "He's contacting your employer. Word is he's pushing to have you blacklisted from every major firm in the city." Clara's tone hardened. "But we can fight this." How Blake's voice cracked, hating the vulnerability but feeling the weight of Arthur's influence. "He has half the city in his pocket. He'll bury me." "Not if we play it smart," Clara insisted. "We can expose his interference, gather evidence, and take it public if needed. I'll reach out to my contacts, see who's willing to push back." Blake exhaled slowly. "Do it." Whatever it takes. He ended the call, feeling a mix of hope and despair. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore, it was about his survival. That evening Blake returned home, the exhaustion weighing on him. Arthur's threats echoed in his head, fueling a fire within him. He poured himself a drink, letting the burn of the whiskey dull his anger. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find a courier holding a manila envelope. "For Blake Reeves," the man said, handing it over. Blake signed and closed the door, his heart sinking. He already knew what it was. Opening the envelope, he found legal documents from Arthur's team, demanding that he vacate their home, relinquish all rights to shared assets, and agree to a quick, uncontested divorce. The terms were ruthless, leaving him with almost nothing. As he scanned the pages, his hands shook. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Arthur Walkaway, Blake. "This is your only chance." He stared at the note, feeling its weight pressing down on him. But instead of breaking, something within him hardened. Picking up a pen, he scribbled a single word at the bottom and placed the papers back in the envelope. No, Blake wouldn't be bullied, not by Arthur, not by Elise. The real battle had just started. Over the next few months, he channeled his pain and Arthur's threats into a fierce resolve to fight back and reclaim his life. He knew acting hastily was a mistake. Arthur Langford and Richard were influential and well-connected, but Blake understood that their power was also their vulnerability. The higher they rose, the harder they would fall. His first step was to sell the house. It had become a reminder of broken promises and lost trust. He didn't want it anymore, and selling quickly would keep Arthur and Elise from seizing the asset. He met with a real estate agent using a pseudonym, a hat pulled low over his eyes. "Quick sale," he instructed, his voice firm. No questions, the agent nodded, sensing the urgency. Within weeks, the house was sold, and Blake watched from across the street as the new owners moved in, feeling nothing but relief. Next, he liquidated investments and savings accounts in his name, transferring the funds into anonymous offshore accounts. Using connections he'd made over years in finance, he made sure each transaction was handled with total secrecy. Arthur's reach was vast, but even he had blind spots. Finally, Blake quietly resigned from his job, severing another tie that could be used against him. During the day, Blake seemed to fade into the background, appearing like a man beaten down by divorce and scandal. But at night he meticulously gathered evidence, hiring investigators to not only dig into Elise and Richard's affair, but to uncover every hidden secret in their careers. But it was a laborious process, involving document reviews, discreet calls, and chasing down even the wildest rumors. One late night, Blake sat at his kitchen table, his laptop casting a dim glow on his face. He opened an encrypted folder revealing emails and financial records linking Richard to illegal offshore transactions and questionable mergers. Blake's pulse quickened. This was it, the proof he needed that Richard was more than just unfaithful, he was a fraud. "Got you," he muttered, leaning back for the first time in months, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. Gathering evidence was only half of the strategy. The release had to be perfectly timed to inflict maximum damage. He brought in Clara, his lawyer, to ensure everything was airtight. Initially, she was hesitant, aware of the risks in challenging such powerful figures, but Blake's determination and the damning evidence convinced her. "This is risky," Clara warned one evening in her dimly lit office. "Arthur Langford won't back down easily. You know what he's capable of." Blake's eyes held a steely determination she hadn't seen before. "I'm counting on it," he replied. Clara sighed, finally agreeing. "Once we set this in motion, there's no turning back." "I'm ready," he replied, leaning forward, his voice low. "We expose everything, every shady deal Richard's made, every string Arthur pulled to manipulate the system. We hit them with everything we've got." The days leading up to the release were tense. Blake moved between safe locations, vigilant for any signs he was being followed. He barely slept, burdened by the gravity of what he was about to do. Then the day arrived. With Clara's help, they compiled every document and delivered it to trusted media contacts, law enforcement, and regulatory bodies. The fallout was immediate and devastating. News outlets exploded with reports on the scandal, labeling it one of the largest financial frauds in recent history. Richard's name dominated the headlines as his empire collapsed. Investors withdrew, board members resigned, and lawsuits flooded in. He was summoned by federal investigators, and his assets were frozen pending further inquiry. But the damage didn't stop there. Arthur Langford's connections to Richard's illegal dealings surfaced, with photos revealing him at secret meetings, pulling strings behind the scenes. His well-crafted image as a business mogul and philanthropist was destroyed. The stock value of his company plummeted, and his allies distanced themselves to avoid the fallout. Blake observed it all from afar, standing in a modest, windowless apartment with the TV illuminating the room as a news anchor detailed the scandal, emphasizing the financial ruin looming over Richard and Arthur. As sources say, this may only be the beginning. With potential criminal charges on the horizon, Blake took a sip of whiskey, the burn in his throat a grim comfort. It wasn't joy he felt, but a somber satisfaction. He had lost everything, but so had they. Amid the chaos, Elise called. Blake stared at her name on the screen, debating whether to answer. Eventually, he accepted the call. Blake, her voice cracked, desperate. "You did this, didn't you? You've ruined everything." He was silent for a long moment before responding, his voice flat. "You ruined us, Elise." "I made a mistake," she pleaded. "But this? You're destroying lives." Blake closed his eyes, pushing back the memories of their life together. "Goodbye." Elise ended the call and blocked her number. Arthur was next. This time it was a knock at his door. Blake opened it to find Arthur, disheveled and furious. "You think this is over?" Arthur snarled, stepping inside uninvited. "You think you've won?" Blake met his gaze, unmoved. "Get out." Arthur sneered. "I'll find a way to fix this. I'll bury you." "You already tried that," Blake replied, voice steady. "Look where it got you." He stepped closer, his tone icy. "This is your mess. Clean it up." Arthur's face twisted in rage before he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Blake watched him leave, knowing this was only the start of Arthur's downfall. In the following weeks, Blake disappeared. He changed his name, relocated to a new city, and began again. Though he had lost everything, he'd regained his freedom. From a distance, he heard of the continued struggles of Arthur and Richard, court battles, financial losses, public disgrace. Elise, too, was caught in the crossfire, her privileged life slipping away. Blake inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift, even if just a little. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to think of a future that was truly his. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting hues of orange and purple across the sky. Blake leaned against the wooden railing of the small cottage he now called home. It was quiet here, nestled deep in the countryside, far removed from the chaos of his old life. The birds chirped, the wind rustled the trees, and for a brief moment he felt a sense of peace. 5 years had slipped by since Blake had enacted his revenge, and in that time he had gradually rebuilt his life piece by piece. No longer consumed by betrayal or vengeance, he had found stability. Now working as a financial consultant for small businesses, Blake found fulfillment and the freedom he'd once longed for. His life was simpler, shaped from the remnants of his past, but it was his. As he stood in quiet thought, the front door creaked open, and Grace stepped outside, holding a steaming cup of tea. Her soft brown hair caught the last of the day's sunlight as she smiled, a smile that had become his constant in recent years. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, offering the mug. Blake accepted it, savoring its warmth. "Just reflecting on how far I've come," he replied, his voice calm and steady. Grace leaned against the railing, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I hope they're mostly good memories," she said. Blake turned toward her, her presence grounding him in the present whenever memories tried to pull him under. He placed his hand over hers, murmuring, "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Grace," she squeezed his hand. "Good thing you don't have to find out. Now come on, dinner's getting cold." That evening, they ate in the warmth of their kitchen, laughing over shared stories and light-hearted jokes, a sense of normalcy Blake once thought he'd never find again. As they were clearing the table, a soft knock echoed through the house. Frowning, Blake dried his hands. "I'll get it," he said, heading to the door. When he opened it, a courier stood there, holding a worn envelope. "Blake Reeves?" the man asked. Blake nodded, taking the envelope and signing for it. The letter was thick and well-worn, with no return address. "What is it?" Grace asked, picking up on his unease. "Not sure," he replied, walking over to the table. He carefully slid his finger under the seal, unfolding the letter inside. His breath caught as he reached the signature at the bottom. Elise. He read it silently, feeling his heart beat faster. Her words were full of desperation, pleading, "Blake, I've lost everything. My father disowned me. Richard is in prison. I have no one. If you have even a bit of compassion left, please help me. I was wrong. I know that now. I'm sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it." Blake placed the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment he simply stared, the memories flooding back, the good, the bad, and the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. A mix of emotions surfaced: anger, pity, sadness. But above all, he felt nothing. Her words no longer held power over him. Grace rested a hand on his shoulder. "Who's it from?" she asked gently. "Elise," he replied, feeling as though the name were a distant echo. Grace's eyes softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" Blake shook his head. "Not really." He placed the letter in a drawer, closing it with finality. "It's over." "Are you sure?" Grace asked, her concern evident. Blake looked back at her. "Yes, I've moved on. She's just a ghost now." The next day, Blake went about his usual routine, working on reports, taking a stroll through the fields, and enjoying lunch with Grace. Still, the letter lingered in his mind, and he couldn't help wondering what had become of Elise. He'd heard scattered rumors over the years of her father's disgrace, of Richard's imprisonment, but he'd never sought to verify any of it. It didn't matter to him anymore. That evening, as he and Grace sat on the porch, sipping wine under a starlit sky, she broke the comfortable silence. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" he asked, turning to her. Not helping her, Grace replied, her gaze thoughtful. "She's asking for compassion, Blake." He considered her words carefully. "She made her choices, and I made mine. I gave her everything once, and she threw it away." Grace nodded, her eyes kind rather than judgmental. "Just remember, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you." Blake looked up at the stars, letting her words resonate. Maybe she was right. Perhaps holding on to resentment would only weigh him down. But forgiving Elise didn't mean letting her back into his life. It meant freeing himself from the grip of the past. He reached for Grace's hand, feeling a wave of peace wash over him. "I'll think about it," he said softly. Weeks slipped by, and Blake kept moving forward, focused on the life he had built. He never responded to Elise's letter. There was simply nothing left to say. One afternoon, as he and Grace strolled through a lively market, he realized that the echoes of his past no longer haunted him. They were just that, echoes, fading with each step. "You okay?" Grace asked, noticing his far-off look. "I am," Blake answered, smiling at her. "Really, I am." They continued walking, hand in hand, the sounds of the market fading into the background. Blake had found his peace, and he knew nothing, not even the shadows of his past, could ever take that away from him.